Are you ready?
Professor answers Middle East questions. Why doesn't democracy work in the Middle East? Hit me.
I'm Tariq Masood from Harvard University. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Middle East Support.
What a name.
All right, let's look at the first question. Here's a question from @PatrioticMommy1. Anyone know what Middle East countries are saying about the US bombing nuclear sites in Iran?
Patriotic Mummy 1? Patriotic Mummy? What are they saying about the bombing? Yeah, what are they saying?
A lot of Arabs in particular don't like the idea of the United States bombing a Muslim country in conjunction with Israel. That's a very powerful strain of public discourse in the Arab and indeed Muslim world.
Interestingly phrased. So by the way the professor is saying this, Arabs don't like it when you bomb Muslims. Kind of makes it sound like they don't get it if you bomb Christians or atheists. Pagans. You can bomb the heathens. You can bomb the pagans. Just don't bomb the Muslims. Okay, fine.
But on the flip side, a lot of Arab countries are afraid of Iran. They're particularly worried that the Iranians will use the strength that they derive from a nuclear weapon to assert their dominance over the region. And so they're not necessarily that opposed to the United States using its military power to thwart Iranian nuclear ambition.
This isn't on Wired. How was this? This is gonna be gone, guys. Give it 3 days.
Question from Quora. If you had to make a timeline of major events in the history of the modern Middle East until today, what events would you put on the timeline? The modern world begins in the 15th century, according to most historians. So you're asking me to pick 6 events over the last 500 years.
Yeah, that would be the early modern period.
It's really hard to do. The first is 1453, when Mehmet II conquers Constantinople, renaming it Istanbul. And that really is the beginning of the Ottomans' rise to power. They conquer the entirety of the Arab world, and it remains under their control for the next 500 years.
That's a very good pick, actually, historically speaking. When it comes to the influential effects of any given historical occurrence and date, I'd like to underline, isn't that crazy though? It used to be called Constantinople, and then it's renamed Istanbul, but before being called Constantinople, it was called Byzantium. It's the same place.
The second point I would put there is in 1492, the Spanish Reconquista. The Spaniards,
of course,
force out the Arabs who had been controlling Spain since the 700s. Then I'd come to 1744, a local tribal leader in Central Arabia, Muhammad al-Saud, forges an alliance with a local religious leader named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And that gives rise to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, whose leaders are the descendants of al-Saud. The other thing it gives rise to is very puritanical understanding of Islam that we call Wahhabism, the radical ideology that eventually finds expression in organizations like Al-Qaeda. Then I'd come to 1798. Napoleon invades Egypt, one of the beginnings of Western colonialism in the Arab world. The next date I'd come to is 1897, and that is the date of the first Zionist Congress that decided that the way to cope with the scourge of anti-Semitism in Europe was for the Jewish people to have a homeland in Palestine, which in the Bible is the ancestral homeland of the Jews. That sets in motion the very tragic struggle that we're living through today between Palestinians and Israelis. Then we come to 1908, and that is when they discover in the Middle East the commodity that makes it so vital to the world. And that is black gold, or oil. The Middle East is the world's largest producer. The last date, I'm going to say the end of World War I. It's really when the modern Middle Eastern state system comes into being. The British and the French and the Allies take over this part of the world, and they draw the borders that today are the source of so much conflict.
We drew the borders, that's correct. So when it comes to the oil, because it skipped through it very quickly, I did appreciate that he was pouring it, but I actually wanted to watch that for a little longer, if possible, next time, Professor. Yeah, so oil is what made a lot of the sultans and extremely rich. Interestingly enough, though, if either electric cars become a majority, or if this thing that I heard, I don't know, my dad called me yesterday telling me about this possible invention of a water engine. I haven't had time to double check it. And like my dad believes anything the TV says anyways. So I'm like, I don't know if it's true, but imagine for a moment that we do figure out an alternative to oil for combustion, regardless of whether it's for cars, energy production, heating, whatever. That would severely impact, of course, the worth of oil. And at that point, I think we would stop calling it the black gold. So, this is a helmet. This is a Muppet. Now, which one are you? A helmet or a Muppet? If the answer is Muppet, then stay unsubscribe, I guess. But if the answer is helmet, subscribe.
Let's take another question. Dill Chips asks, it's been a bit more than 6 months since the Assad regime fell. Have things improved in Syria?
Good question.
It really depends on who you ask. If this is the current president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara. He was the leader of the militia that ultimately forced Assad out of Syria. And his militia is actually an offshoot of an organization known as Al-Qaeda, or as Americans call it, Al-Qaeda. It's a measure of how terrible things were in Syria under Assad, that this man, Shara, could be viewed by the majority of Syrians as a savior. Though Shara has made a lot of the right noises about wanting to establish a democracy, about not wanting to see conflict with Syria's neighbors, most notably Israel, he has been pretty brutal internally. So there was a crackdown against Alawis. It's a religious minority from which Bashar al-Assad came. Another religious minority that's located in the south, the Druze, are also coming under violence from militias associated with Shara's government. Are things in Syria better than they were when Bashar was around? If you ask this handsome gentleman, things are great. Let's take another question. At Fulham Frenchie asks, is Turkey part of the Middle East?
That's actually a good question because it's a geographical question, but at the same time it's not. It is a social question as well. It's both. In fact, this could be applied to several sections of the Anatolian Peninsula. Personally, my answer would be that it's both. It's both Middle East and Europe. And in fact, I think I would leave it to the Turkish to decide what they want to identify as at this point, because geographically, they are literally in the middle.
The Middle East starts in the west in Morocco and ends at its easternmost extent either in Iran or, depending on who you ask, in Afghanistan.
Okay.
Some people say that actually the Middle East is just this part, and we should refer to this as North Africa.
That's what I would do.
Some people will say the Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah.
Regardless of which definition you want to use, Turkey is, of course, in the Middle East. But a little part of it, right here, is actually in Europe. Turkey has been torn between two camps. One camp that says Turkey is absolutely part of the Middle East. It is one of the biggest and most powerful and historically consequential Muslim majority countries. And another camp that says Turkey is European and it needs to become more like Europe. The founder of modern Turkey, a guy named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, said, look, in World War I, we were totally defeated by the Allies because the Turks were on the side of the Germans. The way we can never let that happen again is to become like the Europeans who defeated us. Ataturk instituted all kinds of reforms to make Turkey more European. One of the big things he did in Turkey, people used to wear a hat that looked like this. It's called a fez. The reason that lots of Turks wore it is because it's a hat that you could wear and still pray, because it didn't have a brim and Muslims touch their foreheads to the ground when they pray. Ataturk was so keen on making his country European that he banned that headgear and said people needed to wear fedoras and hats with brims in order to become more like Europeans. That struggle between Ataturk's vision of Turkey and a more traditional Middle Eastern Muslim version of Turkey exists to this day.
I knew actually about this, not the details of the hat. I had no idea. Although, of course, when I imagine a Turkish person, I probably have seen those pictures somewhere. And so that was the image. Either that and the mustache, I suppose. I mean, not that this is any of my business, but I would say let the people choose at this point what kind of lifestyle they wanna live. Also, because I mean, think about it, just for a logics discussion here, but if he wanted to be more like the Europeans who defeated him, meaning the Allies, not the freaking Axis, maybe you should start by embracing the democratic idea of let the people choose rather than, oh, we're gonna ban that shit, and if you don't do what I say, I will put you in prison. No, that's not exactly what we try to achieve with Western republics and democracies. So I would say, Mr. Mustafa, if you want to be more like the West, maybe start considering the idea of freedom. Ataturk. But when it comes to this for a moment, and coming back to the idea of what should be defined as the Middle East, I think in order to be defined as Middle East, it should be in the East. So if it's in the West, I'm sorry, I'm not going to call it Middle East. So I personally cut it here and call this the Middle East. That's how I do it. And I would refer to this as North Africa. Because, come on, Morocco is as west as Spain. It just doesn't make sense. Geographically, even Algeria is right under Spain. Look at this. How is this Middle East? At this point, call it Middle West, but it's not the West. So just call it North Africa. I mean, that's just me. I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments.
In Europe, Turkey has...
Let's see this one about democracy. I'm skipping one if you want to go and watch the original video. Let's see about this one. Why hasn't... Yeah, this is a good question. Let's go.
Here's a question for Quora. Why hasn't democracy been working in the Middle East so far in so many countries? The only democracy that exists right now in the Middle East is the State of Israel. Lots of people argue that even the State of Israel isn't a perfect democracy because it occupies several million Palestinians who don't get a vote. And it's an important question as to why that is the case.
I'd like to know what they mean by perfect democracy, because there are types of democracy. A pure democracy, like the one they had in ancient Greece, is a type of democracy. But today's democracies are not pure forms of pure democracy. It's representative democracy oftentimes. Then there are republics. So what is a perfect democracy would be my question before we can assess whether or not any state is a perfect democracy.
Some people point out...
Also because when you compare democracy, how it was in ancient Greece, and democracies in the modern sense, they are very different, but we still call them democracy.
The United States, important question as to why several million Palestinians who don't get a vote. And it's an important question as to why that is the case. Some people point out the United States hasn't necessarily been friendly to democracy in the Middle East. We've got all kinds of alliances with Arab leaders who are not democratic and who are not friendly to democracy. And that suits us just fine, because we sometimes worry that if there was democracy in the region, it would bring to power kinds of populists and nationalists who are not terribly friendly to the West. So another set of arguments says Islam itself is not necessarily friendly to democracy.
Yeah.
After all, remember, the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was actually not just a religious leader, he was the ruler of the Muslims.
Absolutely, political leader too. Yeah, he's absolutely right. Islam is not friendly to democracy, 100%.
Last time anybody checked, he didn't subject himself to a vote. And then the third set of answers has to do with the nature of Middle Eastern economies. Many of them are heavily dependent on oil. And when you've got oil, it means you basically pull your wealth out of the ground and sell it to foreigners. And what it means is you don't have to tax. Remember, no taxation without representation. So in the Middle East, you have the kind of the opposite. No demands for representation without taxation. This one is from Smexy Rexy Titan. Is what is happening in Gaza truly a genocide? Here's what is incontrovertible. There is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza of massive proportions. People argue about the exact number of people who have been killed. Is it 50,000? Is it more? Is it less? They argue about whether there's actually a famine going on in Gaza or just the beginnings of a famine. But the fact of the matter is that Gaza is today one of the most grim places on the planet. The death and destruction that have been meted out on that very small territory, on those very long-suffering people, is just extraordinary. And there is nobody with a heart who cannot feel extraordinary pain and grief upon looking at the pictures of what's coming out of Gaza. The question, though, of whether what is happening in Gaza is a genocide is actually a kind of technical question of international law.
It is a technical question of international law, as it should be, because it is a specific technical term. I have addressed this on my video on whether or not the Romans caused that genocide, which is a debated discussion, by the way. And oftentimes when we look at what Julius Caesar has done, for example, or Julius Caesar in Gaul, sometimes people say, well, that qualifies as genocide. And then people say, no, it doesn't, because there are these specific parameters to use the term properly. Obviously, and I would like to state this, any child that dies is a tragedy. I do not care the nationality, ethnicity, skin color, religion, language, belief system, anything. If it's a child and they die, it is horrific. And my heart goes to the victims. I actually made a statement a while ago when the whole conflict began. Any child that dies is a tragedy, whether it be an Israeli child, a Palestinian child, an Italian child, an American child, an African child, any child we should protect. This is how it is. I won't go into the details of the war because it's outside my area of expertise. But when it comes to the definition section, then whether or not we can apply a word has nothing to do with your emotions. It has everything to do with the definition proper. So let's see how he explains the definition.
So there's a case right now before the International Court of Justice accusing the Netanyahu government of committing genocide against the Palestinians. And the International Court of Justice hasn't yet ruled on that, but they have determined that there is enough evidence to allow the case to go forward. In other words, they've concluded that there's merit to the claim. Some of the merit to the claim, they say, is found in the statements of Israeli leaders. You can look at the statements of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In one early speech, analogized Palestinians to Amalekites, which is a group in the Bible that fought the Jews and had to be defeated. There's Israeli security officials who have referred to the Palestinians as human animals. Even the president of Israel has said there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian because they voted for Hamas 20 years ago. On the flip side, Israelis will point to almost every one of those statements and say they weren't meant to apply to Palestinians writ large. They were meant to apply to Hamas. They say Palestinians, we don't think Palestinians need to be eradicated. We think Hamas needs to be eradicated. On the one hand, this feels almost like a technical question, let the courts decide what is genocide. But if you look at how this question has really torn apart so many Americans on college campuses, etc., it's because on both sides of this question are normal, good, well-meaning people who each have deep attachments to one side or another of this conflict. So this is probably the hardest question you could ask.
Yeah.
Otters in Tuxedos asks, why is there so much oil in the Middle East?
Yeah.
You really have to go back
to the
millions
oil
of years. What is now the Arabian Peninsula was actually a kind of warm and shallow sea that was full of plant life. That plant life ultimately gets sedimented layer upon layer, subject to tremendous heat and pressure, and turns into the hydrocarbons that you know and love. And what's particularly unique about the Middle East is not just that there's a lot of oil, but it is very easy to access. It's very close to the surface. It's not as simple as sticking a straw in the ground and sucking, but it's close. So it's very cheap to extract. And that's why the Middle East is really the gas station of the world. Here's a question from the No Stupid Questions subreddit asked by...
Okay, skipping around again to encourage people to go and watch the original video, as I always do. So he's explaining about different types of Muslims, if you're interested. Iran in the 1960s, that's actually, I'm interested in that because I saw some pictures. Let's see what he says.
Was really very rich even to this day. This one's from Lotus Wong TKO. I heard Iran was really very rich in the 1960s. Was it true? Iran was rich in the 1960s and it's still rich today. Remember, it's a major oil producer. One of the other things you'll hear about Iran in the 1960s was that it was very liberal. You'll see people share photos of women in Iran in the 1960s wearing mini skirts and having beautiful, finely coiffed hairstyles.
True, I have seen that. We'll see if he's going to confirm it as the expert today. But I would like to say, I think when people say, is it true that that they were rich, that Iran was rich? I don't think people mean the oil. I don't think that's a good answer, Professor, mostly because the oil only affects the ultra-rich. You can have all the oil in the world and the population can still be majority poor because it's only some very, it kind of ultra focuses wealth into very few. I think people are talking about general average household income and overall spending power of the average population as opposed to today. I think that's the question that they meant. Let's see if he addresses it.
And contrasting that to today, where women in Iran are kept under very tight restrictions with respect to how they can dress in public. And that really is a result of what happens in Iran, I would say starting in the 1950s.
Okay,
so in 1953, Iran is actually a constitutional monarchy. There's an Iranian leader named Mohammad Mossadegh who decides to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This is the major oil company that's producing Iranian oil, and it's owned by the British. America decides to cooperate with the British and overthrow him. And we do. But what happens as a result of that is that America invests very heavily in an authoritarian regime led by the king who called himself the Shah. And that was a very restrictive regime. They were pro-Western, they were modern, but they also did not brook any dissent. And it all explodes in the 1979 Iranian Revolution led by this man, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And this guy was a religious scholar who believed that the proper form of government is for religious scholars to rule.
So a theocracy. He was in favor of a theocracy. Well, that's the problem actually with a theocracy. As a religious man, of course, I'm a Christian, but still, as a religious man, I wouldn't advocate for a theocracy simply because, first of all, you want even as a religious person, the only theocracy you want is the one with your religion. So it is a dice roll. Depending on where you're born, of course, the chances of it being your religion are extremely high, but you never know. So if you're okay with a theocracy, that could be a problem because it could backfire if then for whatever reason it is another religion that now is in power and they are the ones that now claim theocracy. So there is that problem. But even if you could guarantee, no, it's going to be just my religion, which I believe to be the right religion, and so it could be a good thing to have a theocracy. I think the problem with that is that oftentimes theocratic regimes are regimes, which means they will impose the religion onto people. And that is something that I do not agree with, simply because I believe as a Christian that the freedom of choice, so free will, is part of the plan of Heavenly Father. So if you force people to become Christians, or if you force people, in this case, to become Muslims or to become Buddhist or to become whatever the heck, it would be, I think you're going against his plan, which at the end of the day could be considered heresy. So no, I think people should still be able. Now, of course, you could tell me, no, but we could have a milder form of theocracy where the leaders in power are religious, but they don't force people to follow that religion. Everyone is still free, but they just guarantee protection of those who do believe in those values and ideas. But isn't that really but at that point, it's not really a theocracy. It's already what we have. Oftentimes, our presidents have been religious men, which is why I would still not advocate for a theocracy, because I feel that if we cross that line, then it's going to be a loss for freedom. And to me, freedom is a godly principle.
And he set himself up as Iran's supreme leader and inaugurates what is now known as the Islamic Republic of Iran, a country that is run on their understanding of Islamic law.
I wonder why they call it a republic at this point.
This is from at Selenophile 48. Why are there American bases in Qatar? Because look at where Qatar is. It is in such a strategically important territory.
Absolutely.
You've got Iran here. You've got the oil of the Persian Gulf that flows through here. So it's very important for the United States, which wants to ensure the free flow of oil and the security of its allies from Iranian adventurism, to have a military presence there to keep the oil flowing and to keep the peace.
Makes sense. Let's see this one about Taliban and women, and then I'll call it a day so that you still have plenty of sections to go and watch if you want, and there still is therefore an incentive for you to watch the original video.
Does the Taliban want to stop women from doing anything? So the Taliban are the religious fanatics who
Yeah.
currently run Afghanistan. They adhere to a particularly puritanical brand of Islam that believes that women's place is in the home.
Holy moly. Okay, so I have seen this because I remember there was a friend of mine. She's from Tunisia. We haven't spoken a very long time, but I noticed that they appear to be a lot more like they're Muslims, but they don't cover. Like I've seen them cover a little bit the top of the head, her and her mother, but their faces were uncovered. And at home, they didn't even. But their faces were uncovered. Then I've seen these, of course, that look like ninja. But this I hadn't seen before, I don't think. My gosh. Holy moly. Yeah, I hate that. I hate to see that. I mean, whatever. If you like, I was about to say if you like it, but do they? I strongly don't know. I really hate seeing that. I really hate seeing that. As a Western man, I hate seeing that. Women having to go through this.
And not experiencing equal status with
Yeah.
men. This is a problem most acute in Afghanistan, but we see it to greater and lesser extent throughout the Middle East and indeed throughout the Muslim world. Lots of people will point out that in most commonly accepted understandings of Islamic law, women are accorded a subordinate status. They may not be as extreme as the Taliban, but for example, one aspect of Islamic law says that women should get less inheritance than men.
And there is also the testify aspect. Like if you need to testify in a court of law under Islamic tradition, the testimony of a man is more important than the testimony of a woman.
The testimony of women in court
There you go.
is worth less
I told you.
than the testimony
Yeah.
of a man. I personally don't feel that there's anything within Islam that is inimical to equality for women, but lots of conservative Muslims don't think that way.
Isn't it in the Quran, though? I haven't read the Quran, so you'll correct me if I'm wrong. But the way he said it is that he said he doesn't believe that within Islam there is anything against women, but only conservative Islamists and fundamentalists do. But I thought it's in the Quran. Does it make sense what I'm saying in this case? This is also one of the reasons why sometimes when I see people, and this tends to happen more on the left, I criticize both sides as I've demonstrated multiple times regardless of what my haters say, but in this case I have to underline this. I notice sometimes left-wing people that when you do say something about Islam that you disagree with or that you don't like, and I'm not saying full-on racist statements, I'm saying like a regular disagreement. You say, I don't like this about Islam, or like I don't like when, particularly when it's like those fundamentalists that he himself doesn't seem to like, that start hating the West, hating white people, hating Europeans, hating Christians and atheists and pagans. And when you say something against them, I've seen some left-wing creators that say, oh, Islamophobia is bigotry. How does that work? Because you can't be a pro-feminist, pro-women's rights, pro-women equality, but also consider any objection or any disagreement with Islam bigotry. It doesn't work. You got to choose at this point because the two things are mutually exclusive. But for today, thank you for watching. Bye.